My student works as a deliverer. I can't believe it. If I had known he would be at my door, I definitely would have made an effort to look a bit more presentable. However, I didn't anticipate anything remarkable, merely another grocery delivery. Another evening spent in solitude as my husband is away. There I stood, clad in a worn, thin t-shirt that hugged my chest a bit too closely, paired with soft lounge pants that certainly weren't enhancing my appearance, hair unkempt, barefaced, no effort put in. Then, I opened the door. Liam Walker. I stood still, caught in a moment of disbelief. He stood still. For a moment, I wondered if my mind was just toying with me. Liam, my former student. The audacious, impulsive youth who would lean against my desk during office hours, sporting that effortlessly charming smile, inquiring about the possibility of extra credit, the child who playfully teased me, seeking a response. But he was no longer a child. He had aged now, wider. His shoulders strained against the delicate weave of his work shirt. His jaw was more defined. And there was an intensity in his eyes that hadn't existed before. A moment of uncertainty. A glimmer of something elusive, just beyond my grasp. I ought to have expressed something more conventional. Something polished. Instead, I simply stood there, feeling like a fool, acutely aware, all too painfully aware, of how his gaze momentarily flickered downward. He observed the shirt. The way it adhered to my skin, the way I had nothing beneath it. I watched as he swallowed, shifting his stance. He had always exuded such unwavering confidence during his time as my student. However, not at this moment. At that moment, he appeared anxious. I found that appealing. Oh no, he murmured, massaging the back of his neck. Sophie, I mean Professor Carter, that title. It truly felt so much more intense now, realizing we were no longer in the classroom. I smirked, finding it simpler than confessing my flustered state. No longer a professor. Only Sophie. He nodded. Yet I noticed how his fingers clenched around the grocery bags. He was on edge. What was causing his tension? Liam had always exuded confidence, the one who stirred up trouble in class. He would recline in his chair, arms resting behind his head, a smirk playing on his lips as if he were fully aware of the effect his words had on me when he called me beautiful, just to see me flinch. Are you certain that charm isn't part of your grading criteria, Professor? Because I would be at the pinnacle of the class. It was all just a prank back then. A playful endeavor. But now there was no mark to achieve. Now the dynamics had shifted. Didn't expect to see me, did you? I inquired, crossing my arms over my chest, partly to jest with him, partly to conceal the unexpected betrayal of my own body. He released a breathless chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. This isn't how it should be, and the manner in which he expressed it. This isn't the way. As if he had considered the possibility of our paths crossing once more. However, not in this manner. Heat surged up my neck. And I despised how much I enjoyed the way his voice had lowered when he spoke those words. I ought to have taken the groceries, expressed my gratitude, and closed the door behind me. Instead, I stood there, barefoot in my thin shirt, gazing at my ex-student as if I were someone unaware of the situation, like someone who suddenly felt the urge to discover just how much he had matured. I ought to have simply grabbed the groceries, and closed the door behind me. I should have taken that course of action. Instead, I remained there like a fool, barefoot in my flimsy, braless t-shirt, gazing at Liam as if I had never encountered a man before. And what could be worse, he was gazing intently in return. It seemed as though he hesitated, uncertain if he had permission to gaze as he desired to. I moistened my lips, a mere reflex, yet his gaze darted to my mouth with such swiftness, so instinctively, that a knot formed in my stomach. Jesus. I had to put an end to this. Required to behave as usual, clearing my throat, I reached for the bags in his hands, desperate to shatter the unbearable, suffocating tension that hung in the air. I had no idea you were working as a delivery driver now. Liam blinked, breaking free from the strange haze that enveloped him. He released a soft, breathy laugh and passed me the first bag. Indeed, Earning a degree in communications can feel less significant when faced with the burden of student loans. I let out a snort, shaking my head as I retreated back into the house. Believe me, I understand. He trailed behind me. Though I didn't extend an invitation, he chose to come in regardless. I convinced myself it was due to the fact that he was carrying another bag in his hands. That was everything. That was the sole reason. As I placed the groceries on the counter, I sensed his presence behind me, the warmth of his body pressing in, almost overwhelming. I needed to express myself. I needed to shatter this. You once exuded such confidence. I pondered, ripping open a bag of lettuce as if it had deeply wronged me. What occurred? I was completely unaware of the reason behind my words. I simply required something to hold on to, a sense of control. Liam's voice dropped when he responded. You were my instructor. I turned, arching an eyebrow at him. So? He emitted a humorless chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. That was unique, was it? I realized I was testing his limits. I sensed it. I could see the way he shifted his weight, his jaw tightening, as if he were uncertain about where to place his hands. The boy who once leaned on my desk, a smirk on his face as if he could escape any consequence, now found himself utterly speechless. I found it enjoyable. Excessive. I leaned against the counter, my hip pressing into the cool granite. Seeking a moment of grounding. You honestly believe I was unaware? I inquired, tilting my head. Remember all those times you lingered after class? The way you would gaze at me. Believing I was oblivious to it all, he drew in a quick breath. Oh, that had an effect on him. His fingers danced restlessly at his sides. Then he gazed at me, truly gazed at me, and in that moment, I lost all sense of control. Liam's lips parted slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a softer, rougher edge. And what about you? He inquired, moving nearer. Excessively near. I gulped. What is there to say about me? He inclined his head just a bit, evaluating me. Oh, this was perilous. Liam had always been a source of chaos. Yet I had never allowed myself to perceive him in this light. What now? At this point, I found myself with no options left. You never told me to stop, he whispered. And for the first time that night, I found myself without an answer. I stood frozen, my stomach churning, warmth creeping up my neck, and my pulse pounding in my ears. And the most frustrating aspect, he witnessed it. I ought to have brushed it aside with a chuckle. I ought to have sighed, grabbed the groceries, and wrapped up this discussion before it ventured into risky territory. However, I did not. Instead, I remained there, heart racing in my throat, echoing his words in my mind. You never asked me to cease. I had devoted a considerable amount of time to feigning ignorance of Liam during that period. The way he regarded me, the way he pushed limits, a hand gliding over my desk as he stayed behind after class, near yet always just out of reach, the way his voice lowered when he posed questions, merely to gauge my reaction. I had overlooked everything, as that was my obligation. I was no longer his professor, yet somehow he still had me cornered. I let out a chuckle, shaking my head in disbelief. You were merely a child striving for an A. Liam's lips quirked as if a smile was on the verge of breaking free, yet he held it back. Indeed. His voice was deliberate and measured. Do you honestly believe that was everything? I opened my mouth, yet silence enveloped me, for deep within, I harbored doubt. What now? He didn't either. I turned back to the counter, seeking a task for my hands. I reached for a bag of fruit, pretending my fingers weren't trembling, as if I wasn't acutely aware of every inch of space separating us. It fell short. I still sensed his presence. At my back, observing, Liam breathed out gently through his nostrils. After a lengthy silence, he finally made a move, just a small step forward, yet I sensed it all around me. Heat surged up my spine, my breath hitching in my throat as I became aware of his presence right behind me now. I gulped. Liam. Interesting, his voice was incredibly low. Southwest achingly close, and I despised the effect it had on me. I clutched the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning pale. You ought to leave. I truly meant it. I truly did. Liam released a soft, amused breath. You seem uncertain. I pressed my eyes tightly closed. God help me, I wasn't. I sensed his presence looming behind me, the heat of his body enveloping me from behind. His mere presence sent a shiver down my spine, causing my breath to falter and my stomach to knot in unfamiliar ways, and when I sensed the whisper of his breath against my neck, just a hint. Just enough, I completely unraveled. I spun around, heart racing, mouth ready to unleash a torrent of words, to demand he go away. However, I spun around too quickly, excessively near, and suddenly. There was absolutely no space remaining. My chest nearly grazed his. I had to lift my chin to meet his gaze, and oh, the intensity with which he looked at me, dark, focused, hungry. And the most frustrating part is that I didn't take a moment to reflect. I could have, yet I chose not to, as I was curious about his next move. As his gaze drifted to my lips, then to my throat, and finally to the delicate fabric clinging to my chest, I felt an undeniable awareness wash over me. Precisely where this was headed. I ought to have taken a step back. A wise woman would have taken that course of action. A woman of responsibility, a woman who was determined not to destroy everything. However, I did not. I found myself frozen, caught between his form and the counter, and I took no action to prevent it. I sensed his presence, not making contact, not just yet, but near enough for me to feel his warmth permeating through my skin, excessively near. Way too near. When he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate, as if he understood precisely the impact of his words. You're gazing. I inhaled sharply, my fingers curling against the cool countertop behind me. You're in my domain, I fired back. What do you want me to do? Liam's lips curled slightly. Not a hint of a smile, something more measured, with intention behind each step. Just say the word and I'll go. I parted my lips, the words were right there. However, I did not express those thoughts. Liam witnessed it. I was aware he noticed it. The pause, the battle unfolding in my mind, the manner in which my chest rose just a tad too quickly. And that was the moment he took action. That's when he made contact with me. I dedicate 8 hours each day to ensure that you find joy in every story. I would greatly appreciate your support for my channel through a donation on PayPal, allowing you to continue enjoying captivating stories every day. Not a catch, not an impulsive, hasty decision. Only a fingertip, gentle and airy, gliding along the inner curve of my wrist. It was insignificant, and it encompassed all. My breath caught, yet I remained still. I stood there, observing his fingers glide over my skin, slow and deliberate, as if he anticipated my hesitation to halt him. However, I did not. Oh, how I wish I had, but I didn't. Liam let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You truly don't want me to leave, do you? The most challenging aspect, he had stopped teasing. His voice was neither cocky nor arrogant. It was genuine, weighty. Perhaps he was uncertain about what might come next as well. I gulped, my throat feeling parched. It's best to avoid making statements like that. Why not? I attempted to come up with a response. I struggled to recall my identity, to understand what I was meant to become. But then he shifted just slightly, and suddenly our bodies were northwest longer, merely close. They were moving. A gentle press of fabric against fabric, his chest just brushing against mine. And I sensed his tension, as if it had been unintentional. It was clear that he was just as devastated by this as I was. For a brief moment, neither of us stirred. His breath lingered, warm and intimate against my temple. His fingers gripped my wrist, uncertain whether to release or to cling tighter. Then in the softest, most hushed tone, Sophie, only my name, yet. It resonated in a unique way. Similar to an inquiry. It resembles a heartfelt request. It seemed as though he was anticipating approval. As soon as I became aware of that, I found myself lifting my chin upward, already narrowing the final distance between us, because if I was going to ruin myself, I was going to do it right. I ought to have put an end to it. Time remained. A moment in time, where I could have taken a step back, chuckled at the absurdity of it all, and made a light-hearted joke about how ridiculous this situation was. However, I did not. As I tilted my chin upward, allowing my lips to part just a fraction for that final silent invitation, Liam seized the moment. His lips collided with mine, and dear God, I surrendered to it. I acted without a moment's pause. Didn't retreat. I simply melted. The kiss was intense, urgent, completely unrestrained. There was no gentle, playful build-up, no exploring the possibilities. It was a craving, urgent and wild. His hands, once hesitant, were now suddenly everywhere. One hand slid to my waist, gripping tight, while the other knotted in my hair, tugging just enough to make me gasp into his mouth. And that sound, it shattered something within him. Liam growled against my lips, and before I could even process it, I found myself being lifted, spun, pushed against the counter. I gasped, my back arching instinctively, my thighs parting just enough for him to step between them, and oh, the way he fit there was divine. I barely managed, my voice breaking as his mouth trailed down to my throat, open wet kisses that sent heat pooling between my legs. What is happening? Liam whispered softly against my skin, his teeth grazing lightly, a smirk playing on his lips. Should I just stop? I trembled, clutching his shirt tightly, and I didn't express it. I ought to have, yet I released a sound that was unfamiliar to me. A soft whimper. A breathless little sound that felt entirely out of place escaping my lips. Liam let out a low groan, his hands gripping my hips, fingers pressing into soft flesh as if he were committing the sensation to memory. You have no idea how long I've been yearning for this. He whispered fervent, urgent words against my collarbone. I let out a genuine, unrestrained sound, and I sensed his body tighten in reaction. His breath faltered, the impact I had on him was palpable, and the allure of that power was utterly captivating. I put it to the test. I moved my hips ever so slightly, just enough to make a difference. And Liam? He muttered a curse, resting his forehead against my shoulder. I grinned. That mischievous secret kind of grin I hadn't experienced in years. You probably didn't anticipate that your former professor would cause this much trouble, did you? I softly murmured, weaving my fingers through his hair, pulling gently. He breathed out sharply, his hands tightening their grip, drawing me nearer, moving against me in a way that caused my whole body to tense. No, he admitted, his voice rough, but I'm not complaining. Then he kissed me again, harder, deeper, as if he were trying to consume me. And I surrendered to it. With divine assistance. I yearned for my own downfall. I never anticipated it would evoke such feelings. I imagined that if this moment ever arrived, if I ever lost my senses enough to allow him to touch me, to let him kiss me in this way, it would feel entirely misplaced. However, it did not. It felt unavoidable, as if I had been restraining it for far too long. As if it were something I didn't realize what I needed until now. Liam groaned against my mouth, his hands gripping my hips, thumbs pressing into my skin just hard enough to leave marks. He was bold now, unreserved and unguarded. The kiss became frantic, a collision of lips, a chaotic blend of breath and warmth, and then his hands began to shift, gradually at first, discovering, outlining me, slipping beneath my delicate t-shirt, cupping my waist, ascending. I inhaled sharply, my head tilted backward. The feeling was overwhelming. I understood his intentions, relishing each moment, drawing it out, taunting me in the most merciless manner. Liam. I inhaled deeply, my voice trembling. His lips moved gently along my throat, nipping softly, drawing in just sufficient to cause a clenching in my abdomen. I understand, he whispered, his voice gravelly with control. I understand, yet he remained unhurried. His fingers moved in languid circles over my ribs, my stomach, my sides. Not exactly where I required him, but near enough, almost there. My fingers pressed into his shoulders, I moved my hips against him, creating just enough friction to catch the sound. He sucked in a sharp breath, and oh, that sound. I sensed the impact of my actions on him. How deeply he desired this. How deeply he desired me. That ought to have filled me with dread, however, it did not. It excited me. I entwined my legs around him, my ankles securing at the small of his back, drawing him closer. Applying pressure precisely in the manner I desired. Liam muttered a curse quietly to himself. His head drooped forward, leaning against my shoulder. His entire body trembled with the strain of maintaining control. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he murmured. His voice was soft, barely audible as it brushed against my skin. I grinned, a mischievous, gasping thing, trailing my fingers along his spine. "Then, reveal it to me," I murmured, his breath caught, his grip tightened. What happens next, he certainly did. His fingers clutched my thighs, pulling me to the brink of the counter. His mouth collided with mine, and as I arched against him, he surged forward, pushing, pressing, teasing. I sighed softly into his mouth, and he took it all in. I had lost all interest. It's not about the outcomes. It's not about guilt. It's not about the expectation of being older, wiser, and in control. In that moment, Liam was the one who had me utterly undone. And I was going to allow him. I can't quite understand why I assumed he would be impatient. Liam had always been impulsive, a mischief maker. The type of student who never adhered to guidelines. I anticipated he would be filled with hunger and desperation, seizing what he desired the moment I granted him permission, however. I had misjudged him. He took his time. He was prolonging it, and it was destroying me. His hands moved with an agonizing slowness, each motion deliberate and heavy. He traced my body as if he were committing every detail to memory. His fingertips glided over my stomach, my waist, my ribs, not where I required him. Not at this moment. I writhed, leaning into his caress as he let out a deep, rich chuckle, his breath a heated whisper against my neck. "You're quite eager," he murmured. I clenched my jaw, holding onto his shirt tightly. "And you're playfully provoking." His lips curled into a sly grin as he placed a kiss just beneath my ear. "Perhaps." I exhaled in frustration, adjusting my position against him. Acutely aware of the firm pressure of his body against my own, evidence of my actions towards him. I had never considered this before, what it might feel like to bear his weight. To have him in this way. Yet, now that he was mine, now that I could truly sense his presence, my desire only deepened. I drew him nearer, swaying my hips against him. A careful examination in progress. And oh, the manner in which he responded. Liam's breath caught, jagged and harsh. His fingers pressed into my waist, his muscles tightening under my touch. For a moment, I feared I had shattered him. What comes next? He was the one who shattered me first. That was the moment he finally made contact with me. His hand glided upward, tracing along my ribs. Across my exposed skin, his thumbs gliding over the soft curves beneath my breasts. I inhaled sharply, my entire being tightening at the touch. Oh! I hadn't recognized how deeply I had been yearning for this, the warmth of his hands, the way his fingers splayed wide, enveloping me, embracing me, possessing me. "You're trembling," he whispered. I bit my lip, my breath unsteady. "You're still playing around." Liam let out a chuckle, a sound deep and gritty. His thumbs glided over my skin, his touch frustratingly delicate. As if he were gauging my limits. I was on the verge of breaking down. The sensation was palpable and overwhelming, urgent longing coiling within me. It was intense, charged, and utterly consuming. I had never desired anyone in this way before. Nowhere near, and Liam was aware of it. He sensed it in the way I quivered beneath him. The way I leaned into his hands, a silent plea in my eyes. Yet he remained resolute, refusing to yield, not at this moment. Not until I shattered first, and I was perilously near. I was the first to break. Certainly, I did. I was not designed to endure this kind of suffering, the playful banter, the excruciatingly slow movements, the way his hands barely grazed my skin, leaving me in suspense, causing me to writhe with anticipation. He was fully aware of his actions, and I loathed him for it, and cherished him for it. I exhaled in frustration, clutching his shirt and pulling him nearer. Liam. My voice was scarcely a murmur, my pulse pounding fiercely against my throat. He paused, his breath gentle and warm against my skin. Anticipating. I gulped. No more playful jabs. His jaw clenched. I witnessed it, the subtle flicker of restraint, the final delicate thread of his composure. In a single, decisive movement he broke. Liam pressed his lips against mine, all doubt vanished. The delicate, playful caresses departed. Everything was moving quickly now. Nothing is patient. His hands held my waist firmly, raising me completely onto the counter, spreading my thighs apart. He moved ahead, his form warm, firm, and unyielding against me. And the way he fit against me, it was divine, the intensity, the warmth, it was overwhelming yet insufficient simultaneously. I pressed my lips against his, gripping his hair, tugging him nearer. Liam let out a low groan, his fingers slipping beneath my shirt, trailing up my stomach, gliding over my ribs, and then, elevated. At last, his hands discovered me. I gasped, my back arching, my body surging into him. And the noise I created? It shattered him. Liam muttered a curse, his lips trailing to my throat, kissing. Sucking, biting, just enough to send a shiver through me. You're quite, he halted abruptly, drawing in a jagged breath, his hands gripping, shaping, discovering me. I let out a soft whimper. I truly whimpered. I was no longer silent. I was open and expressive. I found myself consumed by desperation, utterly shattered and entirely adrift in him. As I moved against him, searching, pushing, craving more, he let out a low growl, not a gentle sound, not a subtle sound, a profound, fractured, completely shattered sound. Then his hands shifted once more, gliding downward this time. Fingers brushing against my stomach, slipping past my waistband. I inhaled sharply, my nails pressing into his shoulders. Tell me to stop, Liam whispered, his forehead pressed against mine. His voice trembled. I did not. I was unable to. I pulled his lips back to mine, inhaling him, welcoming him in, offering him all of me. There was no turning back now. Not when we had already ventured too far. I had no idea I could experience such feelings, shaken, unmade, utterly undone. Liam's weight continued to pin me against the counter. I had forgotten what it was like to surrender so entirely, to allow my body to lead, to let someone adore me with their hands, their mouth, their voice, to be desired in such a way. Liam lifted his head slowly, his forehead pressing against mine, his hands still holding my waist as if he needed something to anchor himself. For a brief instant, silence enveloped us both. The only sound that filled the air was the rhythm of our breathing, lingering heavy and unsteady. Then he chuckled, gently, with a hint of breathlessness, as if he could hardly believe it. And I smiled, for what other choice did I have? Are you all right? His voice was gritty, as if he had just sprinted for miles. I exhaled slowly, my breath trembling. Inquire once more. When I regained the sensation in my legs, Liam let out a groan, resting his head against my shoulder. You're going to end my life. Right back at you. I sensed his smile against my skin. His lips gliding over my collarbone, his fingers meandering in gentle patterns on my bare waist. He still hadn't moved away, and I hadn't either. That ought to have concerned me. In that moment, I was indifferent to everything else, for his body remained warm against mine, and I could still sense the way he had embraced me, caressed me, and breathed my name as if he had been longing for years to express it in that manner, and I truly didn't want to let go of that feeling just yet. I scraped my nails along his back, relishing the shiver that coursed through him. He leaned back a bit, his eyes intense and probing, then softly, with a hint of playfulness, he murmured, "Do you really believe I was merely a child aiming for an A?" A slow, wicked smile crept across my lips. Rather than responding, I drew him closer for another kiss, as I still craved more of him. Nowhere near. I ought to have felt remorse. That's what I continually reminded myself, I ought to have been in a state of panic, I ought to have been submerged in remorse. I ought to have been considering my husband. Yet I found myself anchored in the moment, with Liam still present, his fingers gently mapping slow circles on my bare thigh. His breath warm against my skin, and for the first time in years, I felt a spark of life within me. I can't say how long we lingered in that moment, intertwined, gasping, ensnared in something irreversible. However, in the end, reality had to make its reappearance. Liam let out a soft sigh against my shoulder, then, after a moment of hesitation, pushed himself up with a sense of reluctance. I should go, he whispered. I despised how deeply I didn't want him to, yet I nodded, compelling my expression into a semblance of neutrality. A mask of indifference, indeed, that seems like a wise choice. Liam examined my expression. It felt as though he was attempting to decipher my thoughts. Similar to him, I wasn't certain whether I should act as if this never occurred. I had my doubts as well. He smirked, though it lacked the familiar cockiness of his usual grin. It had a gentler touch, infused with deeper understanding. You will think of me tonight, won't you? I dismissed it with a scoff, rolling my eyes. Your name is a distant memory to me. He chuckled softly. Genuinely chuckled. Then leaned in, placing one final kiss on my jaw. Deceiver. Then, just like that, he pulled away, grabbing his shirt and running a hand through his messy hair. I remained on the counter, in a state of daze, observing as he cast one final look my way before heading for the exit. For a brief moment, I believed that was the end.an error. A hidden truth, something I had concealed within, never to be uttered again, until I listened to it. A vehicle gliding into the driveway. My stomach sank. Liam stood still, his hand resting on the doorknob. He turned to look at me, slowly. We both recognized that sound. The familiar sound of my husband returning home, hours ahead of schedule. A wave of panic rushed over me so quickly that I almost suffocated from it. I leaped off the counter, tugging my shirt back into position and thrusting it against Liam's chest. It is essential for you to leave. At this moment, Liam was in motion, making his way to the back door. His shirt was half-buttoned, and his hair remained a disheveled mess. I hurried to the front door, attempting to tame my hair, striving to appear composed, doing my best not to resemble a woman who had just allowed her former student to disrupt her life. Within the culinary space, the doorknob twisted. I inhaled deeply, compelled to smile. Then my husband stepped inside, and behind him, holding Liam, stood with another grocery bag. Still aglow, still a bit winded, still quite present. Our gazes intertwined, his lips quivered slightly. Then he smirked. Hello, Professor. Mine. Divine. Enjoy this video and consider subscribing to Nasty Talks. Remember to share this video with your friends on WhatsApp. Thus, they can partake in the enjoyment as well. Thank you for your presence alongside me.